Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a really ambitious idea. What if every single language on Earth, from English to Mandarin, all came from one single universal particle?
So, could that even be possible? Well, the theory we're diving into today says absolutely yes. It argues that there's a fundamental building block for literally every language ever spoken. That's a huge claim, right? Trying to find a single root for all of human communication.
Okay, so the entire framework for this hypothesis, it's all built around one powerful concept, EK. Let's break down exactly what that is.
All right, so at its most basic level, EK means the number one. And this is a really fascinating first step because it immediately connects language to something totally universal, math. It's like finding a shared starting point. You can almost think of it like the number one in Euler's identity, which is famous for beautifully tying together all these core mathematical ideas. The theory suggests EK does something similar for language.
But it's not just about math. The idea of one also stretches to mean the individual, the I, the self. And this is huge because it puts identity right at the very heart of language. It suggests that before we can say anything else, we have to be able to say, I am.
Now, the source material gives this thing a very specific name. It calls it the Phil-Grace particle of letters, as elements. Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know. But the really important part is that last bit, letters as elements. It's framing EK not just as a concept, but as the actual stuff that all letters are made of. Kind of like how atoms build molecules.
Okay, so with that foundational idea of SK in place, the hypothesis then tries to trace its path through history, basically by laying out a very specific family tree of writing systems.
So how does this particle actually move through time? Well, the theory lays out a direct line. It all starts with the ancient Proto-Sinaitic script. From there, it argues, this parent script branches out into major systems you might have heard of, like Phoenician, Aramaic, and Brahmi. And here's the key part. The claim is that all these different streams eventually flow together and culminate in something called Gurmukhi. This is presented as the ultimate synthesis, the system that brings together all the core features of its ancestors.
And this is where things get really interesting. The theory argues that the connection isn't just about history, it's about ecology. The claim is that language is directly tied to the fundamental elements of our planet, the sun, the moon, the earth.
Yeah, according to this idea, there's a deep ecological connection literally embedded in the shape and sound of our alphabets. Every single letter it's proposed is actually made up of three distinct natural forces or streams.
And this table here really lays out that mapping. So you've got three streams. First, there's akshara, which is linked to the sun and phonic sounds. That's the actual physical way you make sounds. Then you have akara, tied to the moon and phonemic sounds. Those are the abstract sounds that actually change a word's meaning. And finally, akshara, which is linked to the earth and allophonic sounds. Those tiny variations in a sound that don't really change the meaning. What's wild is that the theory even connects these to traditional crafts, weaving the very structure of language right into the culture.
So starting from this deep link to ecology, the hypothesis builds to a really powerful argument. It wants us to shift our focus away from big, broad languages to something much more local and maybe more fundamental.
And this really is a huge shift in perspective. The whole argument is that we've been focusing on the wrong thing. It's not about languages, it's about dialects, the super local ways people actually talk. The theory says these are the true bedrock, and what's scary is they're disappearing even faster than the big languages we hear about.
So what's the real difference here? Well, the theory sees languages as these big systems, tied to nations and religions. But dialects, they're tied to something more basic, the local ecology. And get this, here's the most radical part. It claims a dialect can work like a computer's operating system, one that can run multiple different software languages. If that's true, it means dialects are a much deeper container for culture than language itself.
And all of this leads to a pretty direct call to action. Look, if dialects are truly different from languages, then they need their own kind of protection, right? So the idea is to push for things like an international decade of indigenous dialects, create new intellectual property protections just for them, and, this is key, stop trying to just preserve them in dusty dictionaries. Instead, the push is to capture them in living archives using audio, video, and film.
Okay, so let's zoom out. What's the big picture? What's the main thing to take away from this really complex but fascinating hypothesis?
Well, at the end of the day, this theory really asks us to see language as so much more than just a tool for communication. It frames it as a living, breathing system, one that's deeply woven into who we are, where we live, and our entire cultural story.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty big thought to chew on. If we go with this idea,
that our words are literally tied to the environment around us, then what do we really lose when a dialect vanishes? It's not just a collection of words, is it? It might just be an entire way of seeing the world that disappears forever.